So we got 91 days. My God, that's easy. We'll sleep when we're dead.
Hello and welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. That was newly minted Democratic VP nominee Tim Walz last night in Philly. His hair was not perfect, but he was drawing some blood on Donald Trump. Let's admit it. We've had some strong views about Tim Walz here at the Bulwark. Also you, the listeners, but the vast majority of us barely know him at all. So I wanted to bring on somebody that does. Peter Callaghan is staff writer for MinnPost, which is a great independent news outlet. If you care, have connections to Minnesota, highly recommend supporting them. Nonprofit newsroom. He covers the Minnesota State House and has been doing so since Tim Walz was governor. How you doing, Peter? Thanks for coming on.
Very good. Thanks for having me. It's fun.
Give us the backstory here. So Tim Walz was in Congress, I guess, and from 06 through 16, then decided to run for governor, and sort of that's when you intersected with him. So just give us a little bit of the origin story of you kind of covering and following Tim Walz.
It's interesting because he was a member of Congress in the southern corner of the state. So that is somewhat rural, has Mankato, and it's Mankato, not Mankato for all of you out there.
Okay.
And he, Rochester, which is Mayo Clinic and a lot of farmland. And he was able to win that seat from an incumbent Republican and hold it for 6 terms. And as soon as he left, they lost that seat. So that's sort of his story when he gets to Congress. He's a moderate Democrat who can win in rural areas, one of the few Democrats who was representing a rural area. And that's really kind of where he then ran for governor. It's interesting, he ran for governor in 2018, and he did not get the DFL. And I'll say DFL, and I'll save you the time of saying what the hell is the DFL. Democratic Farmer Labor Party is what the party in Minnesota calls itself because they have to be unique. It's Minnesota after all. Mm-hmm. And he didn't get the endorsement. I mean, a St. Paul liberal, more liberal than him, House member got the DFL endorsement. He was not necessarily trusted by the progressive wing of the party. One of the reasons he selected Peggy Flanagan as his running mate that election is she is a Twin Cities suburban, very well credentialed in the sort of Senator Paul Wellstone wing of the party. So he felt he had to bring someone like that onto his ticket to provide some entree to the progressives. Reverse
balance from what the projection is right now, kind of. Who is the? I don't remember. Who is the? Who had the DFL endorsement? Do you remember?
Sure. It was now Senate Majority Leader Erin Murphy.
Oh, okay.
And she was the endorsed candidate that year. He did not, and it's not uncommon in the Democratic side in Minnesota to not abide by the endorsement. So he entered that primary anyway and won it quite handily.
Okay, so he comes in with a reputation, and I think this is sort of when trying to decode, the Tim Walz ideology. It's funny. We played on yesterday's show, Nancy Pelosi talking about him, and in Congress, he really was kind of a median Democrat, maybe even a little towards the middle from the median. Focusing obviously, he was on Ag Committee, Vets Committee, so a lot of some of the more those not the more traditional kind of progressive social types of issues. But he gets in 2018. And he has this very progressive record as governor. And so what I'm trying to figure out is that, he's evolved. Is that there was just this pent up demand for progressive governance in Minnesota, and he happened to be the governor that got the trifecta. Like, how do you sort of judge that question?
Yeah. I mean, maybe he wasn't a blue dog Democrat in Congress, but he was blue dog adjacent, certainly. Sure. And his first term, though, remember, was not a trifecta. He had divided government. He had a Senate run by Republicans.
We're both. It was my fault. I started it. We're using political nerd terms. A trifecta for the normies that are listening is when you have the state house, the state senate, and the governorship all of one party. And so traditionally, that's when the parties can advance more in this sort of partisan legislation. So anyway, he did not have that in 2018. regime, is what you're saying.
Correct. He had divided government, and he had to work with a Republican-controlled Senate. And while that would normally be a recipe for doing nothing, and they did a lot of nothing during those years, they also passed budgets that brought in Republican requirements and Democratic requirements. So those years were certainly not a progressive sweepstakes. And to me, that's almost more interesting because of the way he was able to work with a Republican Senate and get things done.
Yeah, let's focus on that era for a second, because very possibly if Harris and Walz win, very likely there'll be a narrow Republican Senate majority, so that would be something that they'd be having to deal with in DC. So how were his relationships cross-party? Was it contentious? Was he a glad-hander? Like, what was that? How did that first term go?
Yeah, I would. It's always contentious.
Sure.
Nowadays, we talk about a trifecta. Trifectas of themselves are more common because states are either Republican states or Democratic states. Yeah. The fact that this state kind of had that transition and may, in fact, potentially go back to a divided government makes Minnesota kind of interesting across the country for that reason all by itself. But he worked with a majority leader named Paul Gazelka, otherwise would be a conservative Christian, but not a real partisan, in my view, and thought that governing might still be a good idea. And so he did work with him, but they fought. I mean, Melissa Hortman was the House Speaker and remains the House Speaker, and she used to talk about how she was the adult in the room when the three of them would be having these meetings, because they did sort of fight and argue about things. And that really worked very well until COVID. When COVID came, there was a unified government for about 6 weeks. And then once shutdowns and executive orders came in, the Republicans completely went away from that. And we had a series of monthly special sessions, which were required to give the legislature the opportunity to not extend the emergency powers. And so they were just nothing but attempts to reverse his actions, attempts to cancel the executive, declarations of emergency. They even started going after and unconfirming his commissioner picks in the middle of the term, and what he called the middle of a emergency, and you're taking away my commissioners. So it deteriorated, certainly, but that was, I think, attributable to COVID more than anything.
Yeah, so I want to then get into the COVID and the period of time where he has full control. But are there any other, during the divided government, were there any other signature accomplishments, legislation? Like, what was he really focused on during that period? You mentioned budgets. Was there anything else that they? Yeah,
I think that's the main thing. That they were able to get budgets passed without government shutdowns. The Republicans actually came around. And Paul Gazelka got a lot of criticism from his own party for extending a health tax, essentially a tax on health bills that paid for a lot of health programs. He was able to do that with Paul Gazelka. They may have been the only combination that could have done it. Gazelka was replaced by a majority leader later who did not have the same willingness or ability to reach deals. But I can say there was not a lot passed. There was a lot of gridlock on other areas of government, but the things that needed to get done got done.
Yeah.
And him working with Melissa Hortman and Paul Gazelka, I think, should be part of his story. It was overwhelmed by the dozens and dozens and dozens of bills that were passed once the DFL, Democratic Farmer Labor Party, won full control, and narrow control at that. That's kind of the story. And that's the story he tells when he goes around the country and did the chicken dinner circuit before he emerged as a vice presidential hopeful. But that's what the D's want to hear around the country, is that, see, we can pass this super progressive agenda and nothing bad happens to us. Mm-hmm. And you all should be trying to do what Minnesota does. Don't waste your trifecta by kind of mincing around and not going and passing your bills.
Yeah. Okay. So let's. I think there are two potential trouble areas for him within those bills. Well, maybe three actually. There's the COVID, which is sort of related to the riots, the fallout from George Floyd and then maybe some of the social issues. But so let's kind of put those in one bucket for a second and talk first about just all of the progressive items that passed. That they are going to run on paid leave, et cetera. Like what are some of the ones that I think he would consider signature or the most important in the state?
Well, it kind of depends on the audience he's talking to.
Okay.
I think paid leave.
He's a politician, Peter. He does he does some politics sometimes.
Well, we'll maybe talk about the Tim Walz who ran and won in a rural district and the Tim Walz who ran and won statewide, where suddenly he had to appeal to the Twin Cities progressive population. His issues changed, and the way he approached these things changed pretty significantly in those times. But I would say paid leave gets a more universal acceptance. Certainly the Republicans opposed the bill as it was created because it's like an unemployment insurance type program. Mm-hmm. They wanted kind of a tax credit based program that was voluntary on the part of business, but they didn't say we shouldn't have paid family leave. That was not the position they took. So I think that one can resonate a little wider. He has with pro-choice audiences, Minnesota has, I think, about the most progressive set of abortion laws in the country, meaning they didn't just codify the right to abortion, which a state Supreme Court ruling had done and found in the privacy provisions of the state constitution, but they repealed almost every restriction that was in state law, meaning, not after 24 weeks, must be in, this type of a medical setting. There were lots of restrictions, and they're all repealed. So really, Minnesota is the decision is between a physician and the woman who is pregnant, and they make that decision on their own. I can tell you that no one is likely to do a late-term abortion in the state, meaning you wouldn't find a facility that would do that. But if you could, it would not be illegal.
On the and then on the economic side, I do think that. It's worth mentioning, and maybe this is wrong. I don't know. I've been sort of trying to read up, about what they've done with various economic reforms, and a lot of it to me read more kind of like free market progressive reforms. Things like the right to repair law, which gives people right to fix their own equipment without having to have onerous regulations on it. Obviously, they passed a lot of money for various green initiatives, but also had permitting reform. There were some tax cuts mixed in with all that. So I mean, talk about all that. There's the one clip of him going around saying like socialism is just friendliness. But if you look at his record, I wouldn't really call it a socialist record. I'd call it kind of a progressive capitalist record, but I don't know. How
yeah, I think if the agenda is set by the Democrats in the legislature, meaning as far as where they go. Yeah. And one of the tenets is corporations are awful. It really is. I mean, that's the boogeyman, and Walz has picked up on that greedy corporations, and they want tax cuts, and I'm not going to give tax cuts to greedy corporations. I'm going to give them to working families. I mean, that's sort of one of their basic tenets. The other one is everything is means tested, with one exception that we'll talk about, and that is the free universal school lunch. So everything's means tested. Tax cuts, those were means tested. Once you had a certain income level, you didn't get tax cuts. Rebates from the surplus, sorry, you make too much money, you're not going to get any tax rebates. When they had the largest surplus by percentage, it's got to be up there for any state. $19 billion on a 2-year budget in the $58 billion range. I mean, that tells you how large that surplus was. Relatively small amounts went to tax cuts. Relatively small amounts went to tax rebates. Most of it was spent. Some of it was spent on sort of one-time spending because they did realize that this was not a sustainable revenue situation, but some was spent on ongoing. But in the midst of that, they did actually increase taxes on high earners and increase some corporate taxes based on how much money a corporation was doing. So at a time of the highest surpluses, the one place that you could get tax votes was if it was on rich people and corporations. So that fits very well into sort of the national progressive messaging that, we're for poor people and were for lower income working families. The child tax credits, though, were pretty significant, and that's what they did with a lot of the money, which was you not only have to make a fair amount of money to pay any state income taxes, the tax credits are refundable. So even if you don't have a tax liability, you're getting payments. And they started a program this year that rather than wait to do your taxes, you can actually be getting that refundable money on a monthly basis to help with the bill. So that's something that's fairly unique to Minnesota. But I can tell you the one thing he wants to talk about the most, and that's that universal school lunch program.
So that's maybe a more progressive economic agenda than maybe what I'd been seeing from some of the outside analysts. So I do like the child tax credit thing is going to be a key, very important one in this election, because J.D. Vance kind of pretends like he's for that and acts like he's an economic populist. So I do think there'll be sort of a contrast on economic populism, talking versus walking. But on the school lunches, I think that one's universally popular. What we've seen, though, from the right already is the tampons in the boys' bathroom. Tampon Tim, they've started to call him on the MAGA media. So talk about that issue and kind of the trans issue and where he's been on LGBT issues.
Yeah, it's the same thing. If it was on the agenda of LGBT community, it had sponsorship in the legislature, it likely passed, and he would have likely signed it. I mean, really top to bottom, not just protections, but protections on healthcare, on transgender healthcare, to the point where there is some indication that people are coming here from other states to get healthcare and transition help here because it was protected. And there was some talk in the past session about requiring insurance coverage for that care, which did not pass, but was talked about. So it's same thing. It's probably, Minnesota's probably the most progressive state. So why would you have tampons in boys' bathrooms? Because you don't necessarily know that all the people using boys' bathrooms are identifying as boys, and that's so rather than having someone say, let's not give them that argument, let's not include that would not hold water with this caucus.
Was there any point where he was like, all right, guys in the legislature, this is too much for me? Was there any?
It's interesting, and I wish I knew this better. He doesn't say that sort of thing publicly.
Yeah.
But I have his chief of staff is communicating sort of like, don't bring me that.
Yeah, right.
That's too far. He would not say it publicly. He would not embarrass or pick a fight with that wing of the party. And he vetoed the very first bill that was going to provide income and employment security for Uber Lyft drivers. That was his first and only veto. And that was a lot of the Uber Lyft drivers in this community are Somali and Somali immigrants. That's a significant, I wouldn't say significant, but an important part of the Democrats' constituency, particularly in the cities. And Uber and Lyft said, we'll leave Minnesota if you sign that law. So he vetoed it and got a lot of grief from the left for that. Ultimately, something not quite as sweeping, but pretty sweeping passed this last session, and he ended up signing it. But with the agreement that Uber and Lyft would accept some of the changes. So that was his only veto, and that was the only time he really stood up. Another one, he stood up on some hospital changes that the nurses union wanted, and the Mayo Clinic ordered, threatened that if he signed that bill, there would be consequences. They wouldn't do an investment that they were planning in Rochester, Minnesota. And he basically said, don't bring me that. I won't sign it. So very rare publicly.
Yeah, so some basic concerns about making sure there's job creation in the state, economic capital formation. In California, even among Democrats, there are people that are like, some of this has gone too far for me, and in Colorado, where I'm from, it's kind of the opposite, right? Like even among some Republicans, people are like, I actually think that Polis is doing a good job. Like what's the sense among Minnesota voters? Is it straight down partisan lines, or are people happy with it?
Yeah, I would say it's straight down partisan lines,
Yeah.
pretty much. I mean, the Twin Cities is, the majority of the population is in the 7 counties. Even out into the second ring suburbs are becoming more DFL or Democratic as elections go by. There's some pockets of Democratic support in the sort of the second cities, Duluth, St. Cloud, Rochester, even Mankato, where he was from. But other than that, it's a pretty red state. I mean, we just recently did a races to watch, which we do. We couldn't come up with more than 14 races. And this is a state that has 67 Senate districts and double that for House districts. And we couldn't come up with 14. And we were cheating. I mean, a couple of those 14 really weren't.
So out of 200 some odd state legislative seats, like, maybe whatever, not even 5%.
Right. And we mapped it. And the ones that are contested are around the cities, the suburbs, those 2 spots I mentioned. The rest of it is all red.
Yeah.
So, and he is partly because of COVID, or largely because of COVID, he became very unpopular out in those areas of the state. But he still shows up there. He still does events there. He still gets yelled at by people there. There's an event here, and maybe other states have it, called Farm Fest, which is sort of I don't want to say a state fair, because it's not, they don't display animals, but it's the farmers convention. It's every summer out in rural Minnesota. And it's become kind of the place where politicians go. And they dig out their blow through caps and their jeans, and they show up
so
at Farm Fest.
They speak, like Iowa has a soapbox where they speak, and then people do kind of yell at them. There's a little exchange. I think it's one of the nice things about Iowa. Do they have and they have that in Kentucky too? Does that happen? Does he like to have exchanges with people?
He will. What will happen is that's one of the very first debates, for instance, of a gubernatorial campaign or a Senate campaign. That would be the debate at Farm Fest, would be the first one. And he shows up, and then he wanders around, and we kind of will walk around with him. And it's not a solo spot, but as he moves around, a circle will form around him, and people will argue with him about some policy or some environmental regulation that they think is onerous. And he'll stand there, and to the sort of concern of security, he'll stand there and
I mean, how does he do in those environments? And I think that's one of these big questions. Some my colleagues here along was saying this. I think it's kind of fair that maybe there are some city slicker Dems who are like, this guy feels like he's going to really resonate out in rural America, when it's kind of like, I don't know. The conservatives in rural America know what the local liberal, and it doesn't mean that they hate him or whatever, but that they know the type. And so I do wonder how's he received in that world when he's out in the redder parts of the state.
Yeah, again, he will have hostile reactions if he's somewhere that's hostile. There's also, the governor's fishing opener is a big tradition, and it's obviously somewhere where there's a big lake, and they move it around the state. And there'll be people who say, I don't want him here. We don't want him here. He shouldn't. We don't want the fishing opener here because of that guy. There is that reaction, but he's not going to fold his pizza in half when he goes out to those areas. I mean, he was ag chair. Yeah. He knows those parts of the state. He is probably a little bit weaker in the mining areas of the state because that has drifted from Democrat to Republican as environmental regulations have come in. But I think he's comfortable in those areas, and he does not seem to shy away from engaging in those areas. He doesn't have to buy the T-shirts and blow through caps. He's got them and he wears them all the time. So I think, at least to them, he might come off as somewhat more one of them, but politically, they're not buying it.
What's he like to engage with? I mean, some governors, some candidate politicians are, do the off the record thing with reporters and are affable and Josh, and some of them are very, keep things close to their vest. I don't know. What's he like to deal with?
Well, I mean, kind of what you see is what he is. That's kind of how
there's not
a
big off the record, on the record difference for him.
Oh no. The kind of funny thing he'll do is he'll be more forthcoming in sort of one-on-ones than the staff would like him to be. So the press hall is down in the basement of the Capitol, and More so early days, but even this last session, he'll just do a walkthrough and he'll just come in and sit down, and he wants to basically BS more than anything. And then we'll ask him about stuff, and he'll start answering. And the staff is like, "Oh, Governor, I don't know that we want to go there right yet," or, can this part be off the record? It's more staff that try to get him off the record or try to get him to not say certain things publicly. It's never really been him. I can't remember a time when he has said, "Can I tell you something off the record?" Yeah. It's usually staff.
Do you have any funny stories hanging out with him?
I'll come up with some, but again, what he is kind of what you see. I mean, he's kind of goofy. He's generally affable. I think what you will start to see is he can get angry. He can get flustered. We joke about the guy doesn't use punctuation. Give me a period here somewhere. It's a sort of when he gets going, it's a series of clauses, sometimes related to the previous clause, sometimes not. Yeah. And I joke that when he gets flustered, he goes from half sentences to quarter sentences, and he can get angry and frustrated, and that sort of affable, jokey, cutting remarks becomes just plain cutting remarks. Yeah. So I think you'll start seeing that. Certain politicians here get under his skin. He hasn't been that good when kind of surprised with a controversy or surprised with a question that he isn't expecting. That's when he sort of gets more flustered. So
is
the
Vance
opposite
the type
of
that
slick,
you think could get under his skin?
It's hard to say. He could, but the Republican who ran against him last time, Scott Jensen, who had been kind of a moderate, maverick type Republican, who was a doctor, just went all in on COVID.
Did the full Lindsey Graham flip from John McCain to MAGA?
Yeah, and it wasn't MAGA as much as it was COVID. Almost his whole campaign was COVID, and this was a couple of years after, and his handlers are like, chill on the COVID stuff. Yeah. Go with economics, go with extreme, go with these talking points we've given you. But he had a way of getting under Walz's skin. And I have a photo that we used a lot, which was at Farm Fest. And they're at a table in the front, and he's wearing his blow-through cap and T-shirt, and the moderator's in the middle, and Scott Jensen on the other side. And he's pointing down at Scott Jensen as he's making some point, and you see his face is red. He's angry, so he can get there and he can lose it. So I think that would be something that people won't expect.
Do you know what got under his skin? Is it personal attacks, or if he feels like he's been caught on something, or
you failed the state on COVID?
Defensiveness.
Defensiveness on policy more than anything. Minnesota politics don't get certainly off candidate personal. You don't talk about his wife or his kids.
Sure. Wait, let's do that. I forgot to do the George Floyd thing, so we'll end with that. But let's talk about his wife and his kids. What's she like? Are they together a lot? Is she the kind of governor's wife that you see a lot of? What kind, any little anecdotes about the family?
Yeah, Gwen does her own appearances. Initially, she kept an office right down the hall from the governor. She is also was a school teacher, very interested in gun safety. That's one of the issues she carved out. But she doesn't really have a political persona like even a first lady of the country might have. Sure. Pick some issues and go with those. I sense that it's a very close relationship. I was listening to him yesterday, and I heard him start to lose his voice in Philadelphia. And at that 2018 convention that he ultimately lost the endorsement, his supporters go outside the convention hall, but he can't speak anymore because he's lost his voice. So Gwen does the whole rally the troops. We fought hard. We're going to go to November. And she gave the campaign speech really as well as he could, because he couldn't speak anymore. So I think that's the relationship. I sense it's a very close partnership. She can handle herself, and she would be fine on her own. I don't know whether they'll use her. I don't know whether she is interested in that, but she could do it if she wanted to.
Yeah, that's good. So the big potential controversy, I think, is his handling of the riots after the George Floyd murder, and it's somewhat unfortunate coincidence because it's one of Kamala's vulnerabilities that she had sent out that tweet about the Minnesota Bail Fund. The pushback from defenders that I've seen online is he actually, deployed the largest National Guard deployment in the state since World War II. People criticizing him say maybe he did so too late. How do you kind of adjudicate the truth of that controversy?
Well, the first one, which is, Congressman Tom Emmer did yesterday, was Walz was nowhere to be found. I can tell you that's not true because I was at the Emergency Management Center in St. Paul for the briefings early most mornings in the middle of all that. And that's where he was. And that's maybe where he spent the night. So he was fully engaged and trying to figure out what the hell was going on. So that part is not true. He was in the middle of it. Did the Guard deployment suffer from lack of communication with the mayor, with a lack of mission at some point in the early days? Absolutely. I mean, there was riots in the streets. We have a briefing with State Patrol, with the Adjutant General of the National Guard, with the governor, and they have decided they are going to deploy the National Guard. National Guard insists on being armed, which was a big decision to allow them to be armed. They did not have arrest authority, so they were going to have to be with police officers or with State Patrol officers, but they were going to deploy. And that was the night that the riots reached the 3rd Precinct, and the 3rd Precinct was torched, and the police had to flee. And they're stationed but not deployed yet was these National Guard contingents. So that's where he's most vulnerable. It was that night. However, Minneapolis wasn't Portland. This did not go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. They got a unified Democratic front and even Republicans if they needed to. Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, Ilhan Omar even, and they said, go home tonight. And their rationale and their explanation was that out-of-state provocateurs are the ones who are doing all this. Is that true? No, it wasn't. But they believed it at the time that there were these influx of Proud Boys and others who were the ones who were instigating it. And they said, you're hiding them. By you being out on the street, you're giving them cover. So we need you to follow the curfew tonight and stay home. And then that'll expose them and we'll be able to go get them. And that worked. On Saturday night, the crowds were lower and the state police, with the help of the National Guard, did sweeps through the areas where there were still protests, and it sort of ended it. So was it slow? Was there miscommunication? Absolutely. But then those next couple days, and I'm watching it, I'm stunned. I'm saying this worked. But it did work because they had a good, religious community, these very progressive Democratic members of Congress, Keith Ellison, who's very well thought of in progressive circles, and they cleared the streets. So they'll talk about that, and you probably need to go all the way through. Now, that's probably not a 30-second TV spot because burning buildings show up really well on TV ads.
Peter Callaghan, thank you so much. For the people out there who are Walz-pilled and want to love Tim Walz, plenty there for them to like. For those who are a little wary, some stuff there for them to continue being wary about. I appreciate you coming on the Bulwark Podcast and educating us. Folks, support the MinnPost. They do great work. I appreciate your time.